In 2003, life seemed predictable, almost too safe. That all changed when I met a man who promised adventure, something beyond the sheltered small-town life I'd always known. He offered a world of new experiences as an over-the-road trucker, and I was hooked. But I had no idea the price that kind of freedom would demand. Being on the road was both a thrill and a curse. With long, empty stretches and only the crackle of the CB radio for company, it could get lonely. The truck became our tiny world, and the voices on the CB radio became our connection to something larger. The winding forest road seemed to stretch endlessly before them, winding deeper and deeper into the unknown. The further they drove, the denser the forest grew, closing in until the trees practically scraped the sides of the truck. Each twist and turn felt sharper, more disorienting, and soon, she found herself clutching the seat, trying to ignore the tightening dread coiling in her chest. The driver remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard. The quiet felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her. She tried to engage him in conversation, asking simple questions: where he was from, how long he'd been a trucker, why he took this route. But each question was met with a short, evasive answer, his words as guarded as the shadowy trees looming around them. It was as if he was deliberately withholding something, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The radio crackled, breaking the silence momentarily, but there was only static. She reached to adjust the dial, hoping to catch a station, but the driver's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. "Leave it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His grip was strong, too strong. For a moment, she felt a chill run down her spine, and as he released her, she instinctively drew her hand back, rubbing her wrist. There was something unsettling about the way his fingers had lingered, as though he was sending her a silent warning. They drove on in silence until, finally, the truck slowed, its headlights illuminating an eerie scene up ahead. A rusted sign half obscured by overgrown vines read, "Bridge out." The driver grumbled under his breath, as though this were a minor inconvenience. He muttered something about needing to take an even smaller road to circumvent the bridge. She glanced out the window at the faint outline of the bridge, shrouded in mist and barely visible through the darkness. Against her better judgment, she asked if it was safe to take an alternative path. He merely gave her a tight-lipped smile and started down the new road, a barely visible dirt track that looked more like an animal trail than a drivable path. The truck creaked and groaned as it lumbered over rocks and through deep grooves in the earth. They were completely alone now, swallowed up by the dark wilderness. The truck's headlights barely pierced the dense underbrush, casting eerie, dancing shadows that seemed to flicker and move just out of sight. She kept glancing into the darkness, feeling as if something was watching them, hidden just beyond the trees. Her instinct screamed for her to turn back, to beg him to go back to the main road, but fear kept her silent. The forest seemed alive with shadows as the dirt path wound ever deeper into the wilderness. The road was narrower now, forcing the truck to slow as it rumbled over roots and rocks. Overhead, the canopy was so thick that it blotted out the sky, casting them in near total darkness, save for the dim glow of the truck's headlights. The silence felt wrong. It was an unnatural stillness, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. She kept glancing out the window, straining to see through the dense shadows, but every time she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, a glint of eyes staring back, she'd blink, and it would vanish. Her hands clenched tightly around her seat, knuckles white, but she forced herself to keep looking forward, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that they weren't alone. Then came the faintest sound. It started as a soft whisper, barely audible over the truck's engine, but gradually grew louder, a rustling, as if something was moving through the underbrush alongside them. Her heart began to pound as she strained to listen, her pulse so loud she thought it might drown out everything else. The driver seemed oblivious, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he let on, that he was purposefully ignoring whatever was lurking just beyond the trees. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, a branch snapping somewhere nearby. Her head whipped to the side, eyes wide as she peered into the darkness. She caught a glimpse of something pale slipping behind a tree, a fleeting silhouette with elongated limbs and eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the shadows. The truck stopped abruptly in a small clearing, its headlights casting eerie beams across the fog that clung low to the ground. She glanced at the driver, but he was already stepping out, his figure disappearing into the murky darkness without a word. Anxiety knotted in her stomach as she hesitated, unsure if she should follow. Finally, she slid out of the truck, every instinct telling her to stay close to the vehicle. Her breath misted in the chilly night air, and the silence pressed in again, heavier than before. She was alone in a place that felt wrong, as if the land itself resented her presence. Her ears strained, catching faint rustles in the shadows, nothing she could pinpoint, yet ever present. As she took a few hesitant steps into the clearing, she noticed faint markings in the dirt, strange symbols scratched into the ground and scattered around. They were crude, almost like claw marks, and they radiated outward in a twisted, almost purposeful pattern. She shivered, a primal fear gnawing at her as she traced them with her eyes. Then, just beyond the reach of the headlights, she saw it, a tall, gaunt figure barely visible against the dark trees. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin stretched tightly over sharp bones that jutted at odd angles. And its eyes, they gleamed with a dull, malevolent light, staring directly at her with an intensity that felt like it could pierce through her soul. Frozen in place, she couldn't look away. The creature seemed to study her, as if deciding whether she was worth its attention. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, her body screaming to flee, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. As the eerie figure melted back into the shadows, she fought to steady her breathing, realizing how close she was to pure panic. The clearing was silent again, but now it felt alive, filled with an oppressive, watching presence. She wanted to bolt back to the truck, yet some deeper instinct told her that sudden movement might provoke whatever lurked here. Her eyes darted around, scanning the dark for any sign of the creature, but all she found were more of those strange clawed symbols etched into the earth, each leading deeper into the forest as though marking a path. The driver was still nowhere in sight, and an unsettling thought crept into her mind. What if he'd led her here deliberately? Why would anyone drive into this godforsaken place at night without reason? A faint rustling broke the silence, and she whirled around, catching the faintest hint of movement among the trees. The figure emerged again, not close enough to touch but too close for comfort. In the dim moonlight, she could see it more clearly now. Its face was a gaunt, grotesque imitation of a human, with hollowed eyes that seemed to sink into its skull and lips pulled back in a rictus grin, exposing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The creature tilted its head, watching her with an almost curious expression, like a predator sizing up unfamiliar prey. Her skin prickled as she realized it was mimicking her movements, mirroring her every small step and gesture. Testing her. The sense of dread mounted, her instincts urging her to escape, but terror held her captive, each muscle locked as if paralyzed by the intensity of its gaze. Then, it opened its mouth, wide, impossibly wide, as though unhinging its jaw, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, her heart hammering as she finally turned and bolted toward the truck. The underbrush snagged at her ankles, pulling her back like skeletal hands, but adrenaline drove her forward. Her breaths came out in desperate gasps, the cold air cutting into her lungs. She reached the truck, flinging open the door and scrambling inside. With shaking hands, she locked the doors, her mind racing as she fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal, just a dead screen and the oppressive weight of the dark forest around her. She glanced up, and in the glow of the headlights, the creature stood just at the edge of the light, still watching, still waiting. The creature lingered at the edge of the headlights, its distorted form half hidden by shadows. She could barely process the horror of its presence as it stared at her, a twisted, malevolent intelligence glimmering in its sunken eyes. It tilted its head again, that grotesque grin spreading wider, almost as if it knew the fear it instilled. She felt a chill settle into her bones, a paralyzing cold that seemed to seep from the creature and wrap around her like tendrils. Her heart thundered as she glanced down at the keys, still clutched in her shaking hand. Every instinct screamed to drive, to escape, but a morbid curiosity held her in place. She had to know if it would follow, if this thing would remain bound to the darkness of the forest, or if it might pursue her into the open world. With a slow, deliberate motion, she eased her foot onto the gas, inching the truck forward. The headlights illuminated the creature fully now, revealing its gnarled, sinewy limbs and skin stretched tight over protruding bones. It was unnatural, a thing that had never belonged to any known world, let alone this quiet stretch of forest. But as she moved forward, it didn't retreat. Instead, it leaned closer, pressing against the invisible barrier of light cast by her headlights, testing the limits like a caged animal. A shiver ran through her as it let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that was both animalistic and disturbingly human. Her hands clenched the wheel tightly as she pressed harder on the gas, and as the truck surged forward, the creature took a single step back, fading into the darkness as if retreating on its own terms. She sped off, adrenaline surging through her veins, but a creeping feeling settled in her gut. She wasn't sure she'd left it behind at all. As she tore down the road, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The dark forest blurred past, and the truck's headlights cut through the blackness, but even with the speed and the engine's roar, her instincts told her she wasn't alone. The memory of the creature, its hollow eyes, that chilling grin, seared into her mind, and an overwhelming dread crept in with each passing mile. After what felt like an eternity, she noticed the glow of distant lights up ahead, civilization, a reprieve. But as she approached a small, deserted gas station by the roadside, her headlights caught something that made her blood run cold. There, standing just outside the station, was a shadowed figure. She slowed, eyes straining to make out details. It looked almost human, but there was something unmistakably wrong, a slumped posture, limbs too long, as though the creature had tried to adopt a human form but failed. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching as her truck crawled past. Her grip on the wheel tightened, and she forced herself to keep her gaze forward. But in her peripheral vision, she saw it tilt its head, the same unnatural way the creature had, that same sinister smile stretched across its face. It knew her, it had followed her. A chill crept up her spine, and she pressed down on the gas pedal, speeding away from the gas station and leaving the haunting figure behind. Her mind raced, desperately trying to understand. Was it truly following her, or was her fear playing tricks? She couldn't know. But one thing was certain, whatever had been in those woods wasn't bound to them. It was free, it was watching, and it wasn't finished with her yet. The relief of escaping the forest began to fade as she pulled into her driveway. The night had an eerie stillness, more silent than she'd ever known it to be. She parked the truck, her hands still trembling as she cut the engine, and took a moment to steady her breath. The security of home felt flimsy now, as if the walls of her house were nothing but a paper-thin barrier against the darkness outside. As she approached her front door, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows near the tree line. She froze, heart pounding, watching the darkness intently. But after a few tense moments, nothing emerged. Just the same empty yard and silent trees. She let herself into the house, locking the door behind her with shaking hands. Yet, even inside, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to harbor eyes, every creak of the floor sounded like footsteps. She forced herself to walk to the window, to peer out into the night one last time. And as her gaze met the dark, a pair of hollow eyes stared back from the edge of the trees, a grim reminder that it had found her, and it was waiting. The next morning, she awoke to a grey light filtering through her blinds, casting long shadows across her bedroom. For a fleeting moment, she almost believed the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But the uneasy tightness in her chest told a different story. She sat up slowly, noticing scratches along her forearms and dirt smeared across her palms, evidence of her frantic escape through the forest. As she moved through the house, everything felt off. It was as if the walls themselves were absorbing the shadows, whispering secrets in a language just beyond her understanding. She checked each window, each lock, reassuring herself that she was safe. Yet, every reflection seemed to shift, like something had followed her inside. When she reached the living room, her heart lurched. Lying on the table was a piece of paper she hadn't placed there, a crudely drawn figure, a creature with hollow eyes and limbs that stretched too long, resembling the thing she'd seen. Beneath the drawing were 3 chilling words, written in a shaky hand, "I am here." As night fell once more, an oppressive silence settled over the house, dense and suffocating. Every creak, every sigh of the building seemed amplified, as though it had a life of its own, conspiring against her. She sat in her living room, clutching a flashlight, its narrow beam her only lifeline in the encroaching darkness. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering with every subtle movement she made, stretching like silent watchers. Then, she heard it, a faint rustling coming from down the hall. Her heart thudded painfully as she tightened her grip on the flashlight, her pulse quickening with each shuffling sound that grew louder, closer. She swallowed, rising slowly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Summoning her courage, she pointed the flashlight toward the hallway, the beam trembling as it illuminated the empty corridor. But something was wrong. The air felt colder, thicker, and a chilling realization settled over her. She was no longer alone. At the end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light, stood the shadowed figure from her nightmares. It watched her, unmoving, its hollow gaze anchoring her in place as dread rooted her to the spot. Frozen in place, she could barely process the figure before her. It was featureless, dark, and entirely still, yet somehow, its presence seemed to press against her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Her instinct screamed to run, but her feet felt as if they'd been cemented to the floor. The figure seemed to sense her fear, and with each passing second, it drew nearer without a single step, as if the shadows themselves carried it forward. She tried to blink, to refocus, hoping the figure might disappear. But it remained, solid and inescapable, looming larger in the thin light from her flashlight. Panic clawed at her, pushing her to take a step back. Her heel caught the edge of a rug, nearly sending her tumbling, but she caught herself, heart hammering in her chest. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural motion, as though mocking her. A low, guttural whisper filled the silence, barely audible, yet unmistakable, "You can't hide." That was all it took. She bolted, fleeing down the hallway, but the figure's presence trailed her, lingering in the shadows, watching with patient, eerie calm as she tried to escape. As she raced down the dimly lit corridor, her heart pounded in rhythm with her frantic footsteps, each thud echoing ominously against the walls. She could feel the cold air biting at her skin, a stark contrast to the heat of fear coursing through her veins. The whispers followed her, skittering like whispers of wind in a long-abandoned place, creating a cacophony of dread that twisted in her gut. "You can't hide," they seemed to chant, each word reverberating in her mind as she struggled to maintain her grip on reality. Desperate, she darted into a nearby room, slamming the door behind her. She leaned against it, breathless, straining to hear any sounds from the hallway. The silence that enveloped her felt suffocating, wrapping around her like a thick blanket. Glancing around, she took in her surroundings, dusty furniture covered in sheets, the scent of mildew thick in the air, and shadows lurking in every corner, shifting as she strained her ears for any sign of the entity that had haunted her. Suddenly, the floor creaked ominously beneath her, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The heavy silence shattered as the whispers returned, more insistent now, swirling around her like a storm. "You can't escape," they taunted, intertwining with her panic. She knew she had to keep moving. Summoning her courage, she turned to search for another exit. Her gaze fell on a window at the far end of the room, dust-covered and almost invisible against the grimy walls. She rushed toward it, pushing aside the tattered curtains that flooded in the draft. Heart racing, she attempted to force it open, but the window resisted, as if it too were a barrier holding her captive. Just as she was about to give up, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway, slow and deliberate. The air felt thick, charged with a sense of impending doom. With a sudden burst of strength, she yanked the window open, the hinges protesting with a rusty screech. A gust of cold air rushed in, invigorating her senses. She climbed up onto the sill, glancing back just in time to see the shadow of the figure slip into the room. It paused, head tilting, as if assessing her. Adrenaline surged through her, propelling her to leap out into the night. She hit the ground hard, but the pain was nothing compared to the urgency of escape. As she landed on the cool grass, the night air rushed into her lungs, filling her with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. She scrambled to her feet, glancing back at the window she had just escaped. The figure loomed there, silhouetted against the dim light of the room, its presence sending a jolt of terror through her. Shadows danced around it, twisting and turning, making it seem even more menacing. Without thinking, she bolted into the dense woods surrounding the house. The trees closed in around her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, but she pushed forward, the underbrush scratching at her legs. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, drowning out the sounds of the night, crickets chirping and leaves rustling. The whispers had grown fainter, but their chilling promise still echoed in her mind. Just keep running, she urged herself, adrenaline propelling her deeper into the darkness. With each step, she fought against the urge to look back, fearing what she might see. The air was thick with unease, the shadows shifting around her like living entities. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, watching, waiting, as she raced toward an uncertain fate in the blackened woods.